Joining us now, our Wednesday insider from TSN, Darren Dreger, joining us once again here on Sekeres and Price. Jeff's with us today, Darren, so nice. Say hi. And we're pleased to have you here on Draft Lottery Week, which is, again, one of the worst television shows we could possibly imagine. The plot twists were few and far between, which led us to our poll question today. So, first of all, answer the should. Should the draft lottery be be changed? But then offer the will, if there's any appetite.
Well, I'll start with a will.
Okay.
There's at least a will and an appetite to consider what sort of changes might better the end product. And that's not just from a TV perspective. That's coming up with an equation that maybe encourages more change than obviously what we saw on Monday in the draft lottery. Deputy Commissioner Bill Daly spends a lot of time on this. He really does. It's something that he takes the responsibility almost personally. So if there are club executives out there or anyone who has a better sequence of events that can make the process, other than the bingo balls dropping the way that they did, more interesting and entertaining, then I guarantee you he is open to that. But they're also very protective of making sure that the lower end teams in the NHL regular season get some help and are recognized for their futility. And there are also many around the league who question whether that's the right approach, right? I mean, force these clubs to either transition on the fly or add some help. Right. And instead of, cutting it down to the wood, knowing that you're going to get bailed out potentially by a high draft pick, maybe not first overall, but still a high draft pick. So there is a will and there is an appetite. As for the television show, I want to be careful not to be too critical. And I do recall when James Duthie used to host it on TSN. I mean, James, just based on personality and creativity, makes it interesting, right? It's a tough gig. It is because it is so bland, even with a blue chip prospect like Connor Bedard as the jewel in the crown. But this one just seemed to lag and lack all sorts of creativity and interest. So there has to be a way, if they don't want to change the process of how the draft actually unfolds, then there has to be a way where the TV execs put their minds together and come up with a more entertaining end product.
The standings at the end of the season, I mean, there's 4 teams separated by 2 points, and it can reach down even further than that, but ultimately there's 6 teams separated by 12 points, which is only a handful of wins. I mean, they're all bad teams. They all need help, in a theoretical sense. So in that regard, it just, I don't know how ironclad the reverse order and those lotteries, what I'm saying is the leveling of the odds plateau wouldn't insult me any if they started to level them off, because really what's separating? And again, no one's suggesting that the 19th place team in the league should have a chance at the first overall.
Right.
But they could win and move up to 6th or what have you,
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. And maybe then that type of a scenario starts to spark, some other outside creativity. You look at a team like the Montreal Canadiens who draft 5th. Well, it's a bit of a precarious spot. I mean, you're getting a very good player in that 5 spot, but maybe, because you're in that retool, renovation, call it whatever you will in Montreal, that encourages Ken Hughes to want to move up in the draft. So if you get more creative in the way that you've described here, Blake, maybe then that further encourages some of the horse trading and the wheeling and dealing that we do often see around the draft, but not of any real consequence or significance. So, hey, the more creativity that's introduced into this process, the better for everyone, especially NHL fans. But I would think that there's got to be at least some level of disappointment as to how things played out. Not because Chicago ended up winning the draft lottery. That's best case scenario, I would think, for a head office of the NHL to have a major market like Chicago, get a jolt in the arm like this. But because it seemed to be so flat when you're talking about a player of the substance of Bedard, maybe head office takes a look at it and says, we've got to find a way to juice this thing up a little bit.
Dreg, the whim of the lottery balls has Bedard in Chicago. There was a lot of public outrage, just the fact that the dark chapter that the Blackhawks have come through and the fact that they had tickets in this lottery to begin with. they obviously did what they had to do to up their odds down the stretch, had the fire sale, traded off a lot of pieces. What about back channels? Did you talk to anybody in the NHL that was upset that the Blackhawks ultimately won the lottery?
No, I didn't get that sense. I mean, aside from, again, the noise in social media, I mean, you're going to be hard-pressed, excuse me, to find anybody outside of the Anaheim Ducks, the Columbus Blue Jackets, and go down the list of the teams that were legitimately in line for this guy. You're going to be hard-pressed to find anyone that's upset. I mean, and the return was almost immediate, wasn't it? Right? Like, how many millions of dollars in season tickets have they sold to this point? I mean, they'll cap it off here if they haven't already done that, because of just the knee-jerk reaction to Connor Bedard now joining the Blackhawks organization. Well, guess what that does? That helps hockey-related revenue. And, a salary cap that we believe isn't going to go up. It's going to be a flat cap of $1 million for next season. It's going to jump significantly after that, and then the year after that. So I think that aside from the selfish concerns that Pat Verbeek or one of those teams legitimately in the mix would have, because he would have been a game changer for the Anaheim Ducks or the Columbus Blue Jackets or any team in that mix. When you look at it from a business perspective, beyond that, the revenue that'll be generated out of Chicago will actually help the cap longer term.
Lots going on around the National Hockey League beyond the play on the ice, and there's lots to get to there as well.
Yeah.
But since you've been back on this program, coaching change with the Rangers, Gerard Gallant, the fifth opening now around the National Hockey League, Anaheim, Columbus, Calgary, Washington, and the New York Rangers. You picking up anything on the coaching carousel?
Well, that one was not shocking by any stretch of the imagination. And you could tell by the way, Gerard Gallant handled his final media availability there prior to the dismissal.
That was something.
He could smell it was coming, right?
Yeah.
And I got all the time in the world for Turk because he's old school, and he wanted to make it clear that he and the coaching staff did everything they could to prepare this team. And the disappointment of being dispatched in round one of the playoffs, everybody in that organization, especially the head coach, wears it, but the guilt needs to be spread throughout hockey operations. We all recall, speaking of the Chicago Blackhawks, the prowess of Patty Kane when he was in his prime, an electrifying player. But he had a bad hip. So the Rangers acquire him. They're not getting Patty Kane of old, the guy that was winning Stanley Cups for the Blackhawks. They're getting a guy that needs a procedure so that he can get healthy again and return to a really good player. He was a slower player for the Rangers, so was Tarasenko. Go down the list. That's not on coaching. That's not on coaching. And I think that Gallant is going to find a new home. He makes a lot of sense to me in Washington. You've got a veteran group there. He's got some connections to Jonathan Huberdeau. They want to get their general manager settled in Calgary first, but maybe he's a fit there. I guess just to pile on to the surprise meter was how swift our colleague Larry Brooks came out with the acknowledgement that Joel Quenneville wouldn't be considered by the New York Rangers, because I can tell you there's some high-ranking execs around the NHL, club execs, that thought that was the reason Gallant would be fired, is so that they could create that opportunity for Joel Quenneville. So that's just, again, another twist in the storytelling and the world of surprise coming out of the Rangers.
It's funny when Babcock had sort of I won't say scandal, but there was a stigma certainly attached to Mike Babcock. It seemed like the National Hockey League really did just kind of dust off their hands and say, okay, I think you're done here. Doesn't seem to be the case for Joel Quenneville. They do seem itchy to get him back into the league. The other interesting exit interview story was Cam Neely suggesting that the players were apologizing to him, that the executive and the coaching staff, although Sweeney says their changes might be coming there to some degree, but it sounds like they're blaming the players. They're saying the players didn't execute. It's the best team in history, and you guys didn't execute.
And I think that's fair. At the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to, especially a well-oiled machine like the Boston Bruins apparently were through the regular season and just couldn't get it done. Look, the player representatives that I've spoken to who have players in Boston say these guys are devastated. And that's a good thing, to wear that level of disappointment. You know, Jim Montgomery didn't become a bad coach going into the playoffs. I mean, ridiculous, right? You know, did they have some bumps and bruises? Of course they did. Patrice Bergeron wasn't Patrice Bergeron, who we saw star in so many games over the regular season. So he had some stuff that he had to deal with. Linus Ullmark might win the Vezina Trophy. I mean, he was terrific. Not so great in the playoffs. And you know, I guess if you want to include coaching in this, you could make an argument that maybe Swayman should have come into that series much earlier than he did. But I think it's healthy for the players of the Boston Bruins to recognize that they did not get the job done. That doesn't happen very often. Disappointment, the players wear that. Internally, maybe they'll talk about, you know, what they didn't do and all of these things. But to be so public with it, I think that's a healthy step for the Bruins in that roster.
Dregs, all these blowouts in the second round. Says somebody was feeding back to me on social media yesterday saying this is the case for 1v8, that it postpones some of the excitement to the second round and allows the playoffs to have a similar arc. And they might be true, but I don't know. We've always regarded the first round as awesome in the NHL, even 1v8 or in divisional play. I thought. Is there any reason for the blowouts here in the second round? Anything you can think of?
Not really, and they have been wild ones too, right? Like all of a sudden now, if we look at the Oilers and the Vegas Golden Knights, that feels like it's a pick'em series again, and that's not shocking by any stretch. I would have given the Oilers the edge going into the series because of all the firepower, but yet 5-on-5, they're struggling. I mean, the Vegas Golden Knights take it right between the eyes the other night, and you know, Bruce Cassidy's sitting there going, geez, I don't even know where to start. We were so bad in all areas. But maybe when you're that good, you're able to flush a game like that. And it's not just lip service, you know, so there's no point poring over videotape and looking at all the things that you were bad at, because it was really from beginning to end. But the veteran experience of the Vegas Golden Knights kicked them back into gear, and they did the exact opposite to the Oilers. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I'm entertained by it. I really am. Because when you see one team win as handily as they do, then you think there's got to be a huge momentum push forward into the next game. And then the next game, the team bounces off the mat and they dump in 5 or 6 goals. I mean, if you're into goal scoring in the Stanley Cup playoffs, whatever round it is, then you're getting a lot of it. That Carolina series and the New Jersey Devils, that one to me is equally bonkers. Because how can you not be impressed with where the offense is coming from the Carolina Hurricanes? With all they've got on the sidelines, I mean, goal scoring was supposed to be a problem in the playoffs for Carolina, and yet here they are. They're scoring 5 goals.
Can't have you on our program without bringing it close to home with the Vancouver Canucks. And there are reports out there now that, you know, Patrick Allvin's doing his due diligence, sort of canvassing the market as the Canucks again up against it with a cap. I mean, the entire world, Dregs, knows that they have to free up some cap space. They've been at this for the better part of a year. We went through this last offseason and then through the trade deadline, and here we are coming up to, you know, another draft and free agency. But how difficult ultimately is this going to be? Like, nobody's going to do the Canucks a favor. Everybody knows that they're in a bind. So, I mean, how much more difficult does that make Patrick Allvin's job?
It is difficult, but maybe you just embrace that reality, J-Pat, right? If you're Patrick Allvin, you just know that if you're moving out Conor Garland, that you're going to have to sweeten it to move that contract. And maybe that applies to some of the other pieces as well. You know, as we talked about, I think last week, Blake, you know, the sense is that Allvin is having lots of conversations, and as you get through round 2, now the list of non-playoff teams grows, so his web expands. I mean, his focus primarily has been in conversations on the trade front with non-playoff teams because the other clubs are committed, and we get that. Sense is that JT Miller will be back, and that, I don't think that would be shocking unless somebody puts an offer on the table that the Vancouver Canucks just flat out can't turn away from. I know that Rick Tocchet, the coaching staff, have a lot of time and feel like he is a key piece. But then you look at some of the other priorities, a third line center, as we've talked about. Well, that's a priority in Vancouver. more toughness, a bigger, a stronger, a larger defensive core. We'll start with one that ticks a couple of those boxes and then see where you go from there. And preferably he's a person who can help them on their penalty kill as well. So it's a laundry list of things that the Vancouver Canucks have written down going into the offseason. The offseason is now for Patrick Allvin, but it's formidable because it's not just acquiring players, it's dealing with your salary cap and recognizing that, okay, if we're moving out contracts, we're going to have to give up either a prospect we don't want to have to part with or draft picks we don't have to part with. But that's the way of doing business in a salary cap world.
How much are they aided, do you think, though, by the fact that this appears on the surface, at the very least, to be a pretty weak free agent year?
Yeah, to some degree, and you're right, because that first wave of players is going to go. And if you're a team that misses out on free agency, then what are you looking to do? You know, you're automatically looking at what's available to you via trade. And I always want to go back to Billy Guerin in the Minnesota Wild because this guy's a gunslinger. I mean, he's talked openly about the level of disappointment based on what they weren't able to accomplish in the postseason. And then you think of the salary cap issues that they face in Minnesota. So it's not like he's out in the market and willing to spend more money because he doesn't have that money. He has to be super creative and he's got to be willing to make trades. So I look for him to be, maybe a key player with the Vancouver Canucks. If you want to go down the list, I would look at the Minnesota Wild as being one of the top teams involved.
A lot of fans connecting the Avalanche to JT Miller just because, that's what they do on social media and such. And I'm sure the Avs have not formulated any plans, but let's just workshop that a little bit. How desperate will they be to move on from Gabriel Landeskog for a second straight year and know that he might not ever be the same, he might not ever be able to play again? Yeah. Are they going to be open to bigger deals? I won't say that they're actually sniffing on Miller yet, but would they be open to deals like that, do you think?
I think they have to be, Blake. I really do. They're probably looking at what's available on the trade front, and maybe we don't know that entirely yet. They're looking at free agency. And free agency does have a couple of interesting names. What's going to happen with Jonathan Toews? The expectation at the end of the year was that he probably had played his last game in the NHL. I had a quick exchange with Pat Brisson. I think it was yesterday, and we were talking about Cole Caulfield. We're talking about Toews. We're talking about Patty Kane and when he's having the hip procedure and all of those things. And he just said, look, there's no door closed yet for Jonathan Toews. Would he be the right fit for the Colorado Avalanche? Well, if he's healthy and he's committed, I think you'd have to consider it on a short term because he could be an affordable add for them. The whole Landeskog story to me is just flat out bizarre. It's pretty obvious that this guy does not want to leave the National Hockey League on anyone else's terms other than his own. I hadn't even heard of that procedure, of transplanting cartilage in the knee. It at best sounds ominous. And then when you look at the timeline, they've already acknowledged he's wiped out for another full season. How do you come back from missing 2 full years? But given the intestinal fortitude of Gabe Landeskog, he's going to pour everything into it. But I do think that McFarland and Joe Sakic do have some options. And, given the insulation that they have and the power of the talent that they have in Colorado, they'll find something that makes sense to plug that hole.
Dregs, the beauty is we made it through this entire interview. The phone didn't ring. Nobody next door complained about how loud you were being. It seems like these sort of calamities only follow one guy around, his hotel exploits. Yeah,
Ray Ferraro. And, on the podcast, we have touched on the personal side of his life on more than one occasion where he acknowledges he's worked hard at, just toning down.
Being zen, yes.
Yes, yeah. Not getting as wound up over stuff that he can't control. But this is Exhibit A, and I tell you what, it was impressive. He answers the phone, the front desk calling, look, there's a complaint, you're talking too loud. Yeah, sorry, I'm doing a podcast. There's nothing I can do about it. Hangs up. Old Ray, man, the steam would have been coming out of his ears, and Yeah, and with Buddy next door cranking the music as we were wrapping up the podcast, just saying, okay, you want to do that? I'm going to do this. Again, old Ray. But he acknowledges he was going over to tap on the door to apologize and explain what was going on until this person cranked the music and then turned it into something else. So a bit of the feisty Ray came out, but I think he handled it beautifully.
He did indeed. Thanks for keeping it down here. Appreciate it. No disturbing of the peace. We'll talk to you next week. Thanks, Darren.